Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Faculty of Emergency Nursing Leadership Programme lecture for this evening. My name's Jeanette Welsh and I am the lead for education for the faculty. My speciality is safeguarding, so I am doing the Safeguarding Your Staff lecture because this is quite complex and it can get into a little bit of a pickle. So I thought best I do this one and then we can take it from there. So usual stuff applies. She says finding the forward arrow would help. We are recording it. It will be available next week on catch up. I say next week because it's Thursday today. So by the time anyone sees the recording, it will be Friday morning. So I don't think it'll be in the library before next week. Keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking, just so that we don't get interruptions on the recording at your end or any echoes. But to quickly come off mute, just press down the space bar and then hold it, and then when you let go, you will remute. If you've got any questions, there's not too many of you on the lecture tonight, so just actually come off mute and ask me the question as you go. I think that would be easier than waiting to the end. If you'd rather, you can use the chat function, that's fine. But it might just be easier for you to just interrupt me and ask the question there and then. If you're struggling with reception, camera off always helps. And please don't share the codes for the lectures unless you've been given permission to do so, because your employer's paying for this. And so it's for you, it's not for everyone as well. Although some employers I know have bought a lot of memberships, which is very nice of them. Right, so what we're trying to do tonight, well, we're trying to look at different issues that can result in harm to staff. Okay, we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about harm to patients, and very happy to do so, but we can also end up with things that harm staff, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. Working in an unscheduled care environment where you're either working with emergencies or you're working with the just admitted population, or if you're in a short stay area, there's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of high stress, and there's a lot of things that could be seen and can happen that can result in harm to staff. Some things could happen anywhere you work, but it's a bit more concentrated at the front door. So we then, having had a think about what issues can harm staff, we'll have a look at each of those issues in turn, and we'll have a look at what preventative measures we can think about that we could put in place, because I'm going to bore you rigid with the titles on my slides, because prevention is always better than cure. It's much, much better to put stuff in place to prevent harm than to try and mop up the mess afterwards. Just like it's much better to not have a patient escalate. It's much better, or deteriorate, in fact, as well. It's much better to make sure that that doesn't happen and we don't get ambushed by anything. We'll have a look at some modifications to environment that we can think of that might help. I do appreciate that we are somewhat up against an overcrowding issue everywhere at the moment, but let's take some time out to think of what we could do. Have a think about what staff training is required, because when you're moving on to a leadership role, you have to think about all these things so that you don't put your staff into difficult positions. And then I do want to look at what happens next after an allegation, because I think that gets a bit mired in all sorts and everything. And it's unclear what happens, what happens when some allegation comes back against staff, and how that's investigated and how that proceeds through. And I think if I can just take you through that very gently, then you'll have a better idea what's coming down the track, and you'll have a better idea how to do the preventative stuff and why that's important. Is that okay? Right, let's make a start then. you're going to have to talk to me. Now, did I put the answers on this slide? Yes, I did. Right. So given I just put the answers on the next slide, that's not going to be very helpful, is it? I've thought of 6 areas that can result in staff being harmed in some way or another, either because it upsets them, or because they come to physical harm, or because they come to professional harm, or a bit of everything. So can you think of what 6 things might I have come up with? Doesn't matter if you don't get all 6. Depression, did you say?
Aggression.
Oh, aggression. Yes, absolutely. Aggression is one of my 6. Yes. Anything else?
Emotional harm or sort of post-traumatic stuff.
Yes, I think that probably comes as a result of other stuff, if you see what I mean. But certainly you can end up with a post-traumatic stress outcome, if you like. But that's not the causation. Anything else? Okay, not to worry. Let's start with aggression. So these are the 6 I thought of that can end up causing harm to your staff in some shape or form. So aggression, absolutely. And I've separated that from violence because the two, whilst they often go together, are actually different. And things can be really unpleasant if someone's aggressive to you, but they may never be violent to you. But it can be really grinding down to deal with aggressive people all the time, even if nothing ever physically causes you any problem. Violence is another ball game, because that can pop out of nowhere, or apparently out of nowhere. I'm on the receiving end in my day job of an awful lot of, it feels like an awful lot, it probably isn't. If I count them up, it isn't a lot. But I'm on the receiving end of allegations of poor professional practice, not against myself personally, but poor professional practice allegations come to me for examination and what's going on here, what happened. So there's complaints, and then there's this area of your professional practice is slipping. So we'll have a look at that, because that can be professionally damaging. Also want to have a look at breaches of information governance, because patients and relatives can get very difficult about information governance. And if you get an allegation that you've breached information governance guidelines, that can quickly descend into areas that you don't want it to go. Another area that I get sent to me is allegations that staff have breached confidentiality. That can be quite difficult, and so we'll have a look at that and how we can tease that out a bit. And then also we need to have a look at allegations of sexual misconduct amongst staff, and I'll take you through some of the allegations I've seen, and we can have a look at those so that you can understand what can come up and then what we would do about it. All right, because hallelujah, and this is the good news, there is a process for all this stuff. You don't have to get yourself in a whirl about what on earth do I do about this. There is a process. All of your organisations will have a way of dealing with this that will be very similar to my organisation, because they're all governed by the same law. All right. Right, let's start with aggression. So I don't want to go into too much detail on aggression, because I think we all know that people get aggressive for all sorts of reasons, don't we? And it's not unreasonable for people to be a bit aggressive, a bit tetchy when they wash up in the emergency department, because as I've been reminded this week, it's never convenient having some disaster that requires you to go to the emergency department. It's always an absolute pain. And if it could possibly be somewhere else another time, or we could have had a bit of notice, or we could have got ourselves sorted out, that would be better. So that inconvenience and what else I should be doing when I don't want to be here is an issue. As is the, hang on, I'm worried about the children, the dinner, the elderly relative, or the animals. So that can cause problems, and on the whole, we're expected to divine that. Then people don't volunteer it. And then there can be the, well, how am I going to get home bit, because you've taken so long that I've missed the last bus, or I will miss the last bus, or I'll miss the last train, or we can't assume that everyone can afford a car or can afford petrol for a car. So we can't also assume everyone has the means to pay for public transport, although it won't mean much to folks when you're listening on catch up, but single bus fares are £2 at the moment. That's marvellous. That makes a big difference. But those sort of tensions just breed aggression quite quickly, and that's nothing that we've got any control over. That's kind of just sitting there simmering. And then you only need someone being nagged by phone or text going, well, I thought you said, or why haven't they fixed it yet? And you're facing a long wait, and the dot matrix display says the waiting time is 10 hours. And you think, the next time I see that, I am going to scream. So all of those things kind of contribute to a bit of a boiling pot that doesn't take a lot to tip it over. We had to look at some other sessions, and so I'm just going to refer you back to some other lectures that we've already got recorded that you might want to sit and watch, that will help you out with some of the aggression stuff. So the first three on managing challenging behaviour, there's 3 separate lectures. In the cognitive impairment lecture, we had a look at patients with dementia and how we could manage their uncertainty and their anxiety and their agitation, given the constraints of our working environment. And we also had to look at how we could manage the constraints of our environment with someone who's got a learning disability or autism, where their perception of life is not the same as everybody else's. And so actually we need to make some modifications to make it work for them. And then in a separate lecture, we had a look at alcohol and how we could manage and preempt aggressive behaviour from people who've had too much to drink. That's a very common one. And then our third lecture, we had a look at challenging behaviour that was induced by the patient having taken recreational drugs. We didn't touch on prescribed drugs. So I'd recommend those 3 lectures so that you could spend a little bit more concentrated time on those 3 things that cause problems with patients' behaviour. And the focus of those was very much, let's have a look at what could go wrong, do ourselves a generic risk assessment, and put something in place now that we can bring out of the toolbox as soon as we've got a patient with that problem, rather than trying to think on your feet in the heat of the moment when you've got 3 or 4 other things going on. And then we also had a couple of lectures on conflict. Conflict. So there's conflict between staff and patients. So we had to look at that and how we could prevent that, and we could head it off at the pass. And we also looked at managing conflict between staff, because really it's not great if we have an argument spill out into public. It's not a good look for anyone in any circumstances, but it doesn't do anybody any favors either. We'll only end up all feeling a bit bad for the rest of the shift and possibly onwards. So if we look at what does your employing organization offer to try and head things off at the pass and give you some guidance, you should all have to do conflict resolution training. In the NHS, it's mandatory every 3 years. So usually when you join an organisation, they would ask you to do conflict resolution training when you first join. And then they would ask you to do refresher training every 3 years. So that'll be on your mandatory training matrix, however that works in your organisation. So doing that and doing the updated conflict resolution training each time will help you just take some time out to think about aggression and how you try and prevent it. You may also have something that in our trust we call behavioural standards. You might call it something else in your trust. Let me see, what might you call it? You might have it might be a document like kindness and respect, or it might be what you can expect of us, what we can expect of you, something of that sort of nature. It'll be a trust-wide document. We have 2. There's one for staff, and the behaviour expected of staff is, as you would expect, higher than that expected of patients and visitors. So we do have a document. It's actually, our document is an appendix of our violence and aggression policy. So it's produced by our health and safety leads. Yours might be attached to your violence and aggression policy, but it might not be. It might be somewhere else. Worth asking the question to find out where it is. And that document says what is acceptable and what isn't. And it's spun positive. So we would like you, when you're visiting our premises, to behave like this. However, if you behave like this, and then it gives a bad example, we will take action against you. And what we do in my organisation is that if we have an aggressive incident or a violent one, those violence and aggression adverse incident reports are all reviewed, and where the patient had capacity or it was a visitor and they've breached the behavioural standards, they get a letter advising them that they've breached the behavioural standards with the description straight from the adverse incident report, asking them, whoops, hit the wrong button there, asking them not to do that again, and giving them a copy of the behavioural standards to say, please behave like this. Works quite well. It's not 100% successful, but it does work quite well. And then we do that again. If they reoffend, so to speak, we'll then go up to a second letter, which requires a much higher standard from them consistently. So that's what your organisation can do for you. They can have those things in, and it would be really sensible to find out what your organisation does about that, so that when it happens, you know to advise staff to use the adverse incident reporting system, and to make sure that they know what to expect in terms of actions coming out of that. And then health and safety have been amazing with us, and they've come and done assessments of our space, and they've looked at how we could just move things around within the environment so that it's easier for us to modify individual spaces to take account of people who've got cognitive impairments or are intoxicated, and also to think about which spaces we use how. So that's helped bring the aggression levels down. It doesn't stop everything, but we've worked to do that. So, but that's not something you can do as an individual. This is a real team effort to put all these things in place so that you bring in the expertise of your training department, of your health and safety department, maybe your security manager, possibly your safeguarding staff, to just have a look at it and go, right, how could we just change this a little bit so that we don't get quite so much aggression? So that can all help. Any other ideas on aggression? Any other thoughts of how you could mitigate it? Because I'm all for getting rid of it. If we can get rid of it, then we don't have to worry about staff coming to grief as a result of it. So prevention is always better than cure.
I think increased communication with patients is always a good factor in preventing aggression.
Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult to do that sometimes, but if you possibly can, front load the communication. So as much as you can do up front about what happens next and how long that will take. You know, if you know it's going to take the labs an hour to turn around the blood results, for example, then say that. If you know you've got 5 other people waiting for the X-ray machine or the CT scanner, say that. And it's 5 lots of 10 minutes in the CT scanner, so that's going to take 50 minutes at least before we get to you. You know, just because there's a queue. So that sort of thing can help. Anything else help prevent aggression?
Body language.
Yeah.
And understanding.
Mm-hmm. And what? Anything specifically?
Things like stepping back and open hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, don't get in their personal space. People who are starting to get a bit aggressive need a bit more personal space. So, you know, arm's length away. Mm-hmm. Anything else you think of?
Avoiding judgments, negative talks.
Yeah, yeah. Don't judge people. You have no idea how you would behave if you were in that much pain or you're that frightened. Yeah. You'd be surprised how effective a cup of tea is. In our department, we had a very lovely secret weapon called Ness. If aggression was starting to simmer, send Ness round doing a tea round, and she'd stop and have a chat to people. Cup of tea, and have a chat. Move on to the next one. Cup of tea, have a chat with them. She never realised how. I told her, we all told her many times how valuable she was doing that. But you know, if you've got a housekeeper or a domestic or an HCA who's really good at just talking ordinary talk to people, not medical related stuff, just chit chat talk, and can be persuaded to do a tea round, that can often, and don't be fussy about relatives having a cup of tea, you know, just give everybody a cup of tea. Then actually that can take an awful lot of aggression out of things. So if you're in charge and you spot a situation brewing, that might be the time to say, tea round, I think, if you don't mind, Ness, that would be lovely. And then you know that that's taken care of. Okay. Let's move on to violence, because we all know that aggression can disappear into violence quite quickly. Now, sometimes there's no avoiding it. You know, if they come in fighting, you are a little bit stuck. So you can end up, it's all just a little bit too much up front already, and you haven't got a lot of leeway. So I'm going to reference you back to our lectures on alcohol and drug-induced and drug-induced challenging behaviour. Not tonight, obviously. After you've done this lecture, go and enjoy the rest of your evening. But I would direct you towards those lectures, and also to the lecture about managing conflict between patients and staff again, just because there's more detail in those lectures about how we could prevent violence. But here's some other thoughts about things that, as an organisation, your trust or your health board could be doing for you. Again, it's a team effort, so you need the health and safety folks in and you need the security folks in to have a look. But environmental modifications, you'd be surprised how changing the colour of the paint on the walls can alter the mood. I don't suggest you do this quickly in you know, just because the shift's gone pear-shaped. But for example, if you paint mental health rooms in a specific shade of green, and it does have to be a very carefully chosen shade of green, it's not just the one that looks sort of vaguely sickly, then you'll get a different response from them than if you paint those walls red. So some quite interesting research around colour and how you can use colour on your walls to change the mood of people and change what they see. You often find in departments there'll be some murals somewhere or something, you know, some sort of artwork on the wall that might be painted directly on the wall. That's often easiest. And where you anticipate violence and aggression, that tends to be quite calming murals that are a little bit abstract, so that you're not necessarily looking at individual realistic objects, but it's all a bit abstract, but in very soothing colours. So that might be sufficient to bring violence down and return it to aggression, so to speak. The other thing that you can do is you can modify lighting so that the lighting is different. If it's very harsh white overhead lighting, that can cause a lot of sensory overload on some patients, particularly patients who've had some sort of abuse or neglect in their past, because they're very easily tipped from a bit of agitated behaviour into aggression and then easily tipped into violence, just because there's something that is very like their abusive experience in your environment. It's often harsh overhead lighting, and that can just overload them. Autistic people will also be overloaded by overhead lighting. So it might be as simple as having a dimmer switch fitted on some of your lighting, or having a slightly softer glow to it, and that's something that your estates department can do for you. It's no more difficult than a change of bulb to a different type of bulb or a different wattage of bulb, so you can still see what you're doing well enough, but the glow is slightly different and just takes the harsh edge off stuff. So those sort of environmental modifications, really easy to do, although we all know it can be a right game to get the decorators to come up and paint the walls sometimes. That does seem to be very, very difficult some days, and other days it's really easy, and I'm not quite sure what makes it easy some days and difficult others. And then CCTV seems to be everywhere at the moment. All your entrances and exits are likely to be covered by CCTV. That's kind of standard practice, so that we can see who's come into your clinical area and who has left it and by what exit. That's for all sorts of reasons. Find out where the staff are. If we've lost a member of staff, that does happen. Find out where patients are if we've lost a patient. Most specifically, which door did they go out and which way were they heading, so that the search team goes the right direction to find them. But obviously in clinical areas, CCTV is a bit of a touchy subject. So you'll be relieved to hear that security firms have absolute strict laws about what they can and can't show, and so sections of cameras will be blanked off, so that anyone viewing what the camera is seeing will just see a black section on the screen, because that if the camera was allowed to look that way, they'd see into cubicles and might see things that they shouldn't, and that the CCTV operators shouldn't see. So there's quite a lot of CCTV about, which it doesn't necessarily prevent violence, but if you just look, has anyone been on a bus recently and had the rather odd experience of seeing the CCTV camera footage being played back to the bus? Ever seen that?
Not recently. I avoid buses at the minute.
Okay, fair enough. So what they do on some buses is they've got the cameras on buses, but then they have a screen, and the screen just keeps swapping camera and keeps showing you what's happening on each camera. Boy, does everybody sit there quietly just looking at their own device or reading their newspaper, because nobody wants to be shown on the screen as having their feet up on the seats or creating a row. So actually there's something about knowing you're on camera that modifies your behavior. But the law also says that you have to know you're on CCTV. So you should always find that there are posters underneath each camera that say, this is CCTV, and we're doing this. But ask your security guys, they'll tell you, or go CCTV camera spotting, and you should be able to see, but it'll be around your entrances and exits. And when this comes in handy is when we need to prosecute someone. So I'll give you a live example. We had a lady who, classic picture, she's been neglected and abused as a child, abused as an adolescent, abused as a young adult. You can imagine how much alcohol and drugs she's consumed over her short life thus far. However, that doesn't excuse bad or violent behavior. And she was she was homeless and trying to use the airlock lobby of the A&E department to bed down for the night. So that's between the outer door and the inner door. So that meant them keep popping open, annoyingly. And of course, she was intimidating everybody between who wanted to come in or go out. So an HCA went to go and just say, give her a shake and say, can you move on? She went from horizontal to vertical and fighting in a fraction of a second, and she punched that HCA 26 times. How do we know it was 26 times? Because that whole lobby area was covered by CCTV, which meant that the security staff could slow down the CCTV and count the punches. And then we had that evidence, as well as the datexes, as well as all the rest of it, to put in, now how do I phrase this? We called the police, obviously. The police prosecuted her for what's called a Section 119 offence, and that is assault against a member of emergency staff. So if one of you or an ambulance crew or police officers or fire crew are assaulted by a member of the public, that is assault against an emergency personnel, and it usually attracts a greater sentence because emergency personnel are seen as there to help in an emergency, so not good people to attack. So the police put in a prosecution for the Section 119 offence, and we supplemented that with a criminal behavioural order request, and we used the CCTV and the datexes to support that application. Delighted to say the judge was kind enough to say case proven without any further questions, and the lady was convicted of that assault, which is really good, because sometimes staff have horrible things happen to them and they think we don't achieve anything. And it can take a little bit of time to get through the courts process, but to be able to go back to the staff and say, look, that's what we were able to do because we had CCTV and you put in the reports. And then it feels like, oh, my organisation has actually done something to support me. It wasn't very nice what happened to me, but action was taken and the person is being punished for it. So that feels a bit better. It doesn't make the pain in the head any better, but no, makes you feel a bit better about it. How do you feel about body-worn cameras? Because that's something that the Royal College of Emergency Medicine are talking about quite a lot at the moment. Police are wearing body-worn cameras all the time now, and invariably they're on if the police are dealing with an incident. How do you feel about body-worn cameras in the departments?
I must admit, I had an incident the other day where a body-worn camera actually incited and inflamed the situation.
Righto.
The person who was being aggressive saw security's body cam and actually went for the security
because they've got the camera.
Because they were being recorded, yeah.
It's really difficult, isn't it?
But at the same time, I find that's probably a rarity. I think most of the time they are a deterrent as opposed to an initiating factor.
So it's interesting how CCTV modifies people's behaviour, because no one wants to look bad or sound bad when it comes back. So it does modify things and keep, you know, it certainly makes us behave better, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because we can be a bit snappy and short sometimes when we're under pressure. So that's positive. And sometimes it captures evidence that you wouldn't otherwise see. I know that a lot of domestic abuse charities really pushed for police to have body-worn cameras that were on as they went into a situation, because so often the victim would then be too frightened to say what happened or to support a prosecution. Or they would minimize what had happened and go, oh, it wasn't that bad really. And it's only when you put it against what the police saw as they arrived that actually you go, no, it was awful. And yeah, there was a crime being committed. But just beware that police are largely wearing body-worn cameras now. So certainly if you have police in the department who are looking after a patient and they're in with someone anyway, they are likely to have those cameras on. Just be aware of that. So it sounds like some of you have security staff in the department. How does that work for you?
It's a bit hit and miss at the moment. One of the problems that we've got in our trust is that there is such a lack of security personnel. There's an initiative recently where we were having specific A&E staff, but it was only one security officer who was sort of around as a deterrent, really, but also to assist if needed. But I mean, for example, the other day there was an incident, and there was literally only one security personnel for the entire hospital.
And that's really difficult, isn't it? Because you can't expect one person to split themselves into several pieces, or indeed to be able to control one violent person, because one-on-one doesn't work.
Well, this is it. I mean, they do say that there's supposed to be 3 security personnel to deal with any incident. However, that's generally not happening if you don't have the personnel to deal with.
No, you can't do what you haven't got staff for, but then you have that kind of downward spiral, don't you, that if you don't have the staff, the whole situation gets worse and you lose more staff and you lose more staff. So it can be a really tricky one to manage to get right. Just thinking past security staff and onto how they restrain people. I don't know how much you know about this, but it's worth just airing it, so you're conscious that this is a debate underway, and there's legislation to be put in place. So there's some legislation called the Use of Force Act. Now, it largely applies to mental health units, but not entirely. So it partly applies in general hospitals too. It always applies if the person's detained under the Mental Health Act, but it can apply ahead of that. So slightly iffy, and that means that all our restraint policies need to fall into line, or at least be able to comply with the Use of Force Act. So that then takes us a step further and says, right, if you're going to restrain someone, you need to be clear why you're restraining them and how you're restraining them. And you've got to decide what type of restraint you will use. And there's a bit of a debate, because within mental health services, they use a type of restraint that can usually be applied by 2 people, not always. It can be applied by 2 people, sometimes needs 4, but it's a type of restraint that's suited to fit healthy adults. It doesn't work very well with children, and it doesn't work well at all with frail elderly people. So there are other types of restraint out there that are better for frail, elderly, easily broken people, where you don't want the restraint to cause the damage that the other variations on a theme can cause. So you can see that we've got a problem breaks out immediately there, haven't we? That you could end up with staff trained in different methods of restraint, and they don't mix and match. So you have to have your team all using the same type of restraint. So just throwing it out there, that can be a bit of a problem. And different organisations do it different ways. Some will have their security staff and their portering staff taught. Some will have site managers taught. Some will have all their nursing staff taught. It just varies on the philosophy, really, of how usually the health and safety staff, but possibly senior management, see it. So just be conscious that restraining a patient isn't quite as straightforward as it may on the surface seem. You've got to have thought about how are you going to do it, who's going to do it, how are they going to be trained, how are you going to keep their training in date, and that can be quite tricky. And then several of our patients in emergency care are going to be in that time frame when you perhaps can't work out what the heck's going on. They appear to be delirious, but why? Is it alcohol? Is it drugs? Dear help us, is it a brain tumor that's just grown that little bit today, and that's pressed on the nerves and that's sent them over the edge? Are they in severe pain? All those sorts of things. So you should have in your organisation an emergency sedation policy. Now, we call ours an emergency sedation policy rather than a rapid tranquilization policy, because we recognise that actually, if we call it rapid tranquilization, a lot of doctors won't prescribe it because they have a picture, it comes straight into their heads, of a vet with a gun and an elephant at the other end of the camera lens somewhere, and that, you know, you shoot the gun from a far distance and the elephant falls down straight away. Except it doesn't happen like that. That's TV editing to achieve that. And you also find that we have a little bit of an outbreak of annoyance from the psychiatrists who say that isn't rapid tranquilization, that's not rapid tranquilization. You think, oh crikey, just stop. What I want to do is sedate this patient, and it's an emergency. So we agreed to call it the emergency sedation policy. It's no more exciting than can we stick IM lorazepam into someone, and if that doesn't work, what do I do next? But that's what we call ours. You ought to be familiar with yours as well, whether that's called the same as ours or it's called rapid tranquilization. And so that you're very clear what the running order is. And the running order is usually try and get the patient to accept oral lorazepam. Sometimes they will, and it's worth a go. Don't just think they won't accept it, it'll be awful. Give it a go, because they might, and that would be marvelous. And then you are going to have to wait 45 minutes. So the worst thing that can happen with emergency sedation is that you put your doses of sedation drugs too close together. If you do that, you'll end up in a pickle that you'll need an anaesthetist to pull you out of. So always spacing them 45 minutes apart. And if the oral doesn't work, then you go with an IM lorazepam. If that doesn't work, you can repeat it. But remember, we've got 45 minutes to contain them for in the interim. And then after that, psychiatry have been playing around with which drugs they want us to use. And I don't mean us, just my organisation, but us nationally in emergency care. And they've settled on promethazine, which of course is an antihistamine, but has the side effect of making people sleepy, which is a good side effect on this occasion. And then the last drug in the sequence is haloperidol. And the reason it's last is because if you've never had haloperidol before and we can't get you still enough for an ECG, we shouldn't be giving you haloperidol without knowing whether you have a prolonged QT interval. But, when they're rampaging around the department high on the effects of dear knows what, that's not the time to be saying I need an ECG, is it? So that's why we do lorazepam. And we covered that sort of sedation sequence in one of the clinical program lectures on sedation. So if you want to have a look in the clinical program lectures on sedation, you can spend a bit longer going through the detail of that. So all in all, these are things that are there to help, to modify, to prevent violence if you possibly can. And heading rapidly down the track for your boards is something called the violence reduction standards. So all trusts are being required at a very high level to report back into the centre about how they are putting in measures to reduce violence and aggression. So if you need a change of coat of paint on your walls, now might be a good time to ask. But pick the soothing colours. Are we all right on that?
Yeah, we're good, thank you.
Yeah. Right, so the next thing I thought was poor professional practice. Now, I see quite a lot of allegations of poor professional practice, and I need to go through and pick through and see what is it that people are struggling with here. So I'm also going to refer you back to more detailed lectures on risk assessment, on learning from complaints, on learning from adverse incidents, because there's a bit more detail in those on this aspect. But you'll have problems with people's sloppy practice, and it's often sloppy practice. It's not deliberately malpractice. It's a bit rushing it and cutting corners and not getting it right as a result. And that can become endemic. So when you're in charge of a department, if you're not a stickler about standards, people will work that out and their practice on your shifts will be sloppier. And if you are always a pushover over these things, they will continue to be sloppy, and you'll be quite popular for a while, but you'll also be known as the sister or the charge nurse that people can just maneuver into being nice to them. So it is your job to call for high standards and nicely keep people to account for as high a standard as they can possibly reach, given the numbers of patients in the department. So you should find that you've got some professional standards tucked away somewhere. You might find that you have individual professional standards for your department, but certainly RChem have some professional standards, and the Emergency Care Association of the Royal College of Nursing talk about professional standards. So they're worth having a look at and seeing what you can achieve. Some of the professional standards for RChem are about timings, but other things are like, you will have your pain assessed, you will have pain relief provided, and the efficacy of the pain relief will be checked. So that's the pre-analgesia pain score, analgesia, post-analgesia pain score. Guess who gets to do that? That'd be us lot. It wouldn't be the doctors. So although it's an RChem standard, it's what we're going to have to do. So that, you know, even if you're just really on it with, has everyone had analgesia and did it work? That's maintaining professional standards and keeping up practice levels. Depending on how your department's documentation works, it's really quite important that risk assessments are done. Now, there's overall department risk assessments where you go around and you look for the hazards, and you go, we need to fix the curtain rail, and we need to fix the tile on the floor that's all bumpy, and we've got a bit of gaffer tape over it, and we need, you know, you get the general idea. And then there's the risk assessments you have to do for every patient. So are you doing a falls risk assessment? Are you doing a pressure sore risk assessment? Are you doing a manual handling risk assessment if the patient's going to need manual handling? Are you doing an infection control risk assessment? Because if you don't do those on your individual patients, you won't know if you need to put some mitigating measures in place. And if you do need to put mitigating measures in place and you didn't, that's when the wheels come off. So you'll find that patients develop pressure sores, they fall in your department, they climb over the trolley sides. You find the root cause analysis for the outbreak of whatever awfulness it was this time in bugs actually stemmed from your department, because you didn't recognize that the patient was an infection source and needed to be isolated from others. So those are things you can just be on and be across, that will avoid people being accused of poor professional practice. And then mandatory training, jeepers, that's always such a thing. I don't know how your trusts organise it, but our list seems to go on forever and ever and ever. And mandatory training is usually agreed centrally as to what has to be mandatory and what is optional, nice to have. And most directors of training and education fight really hard to not have additional stuff added to mandatory training, so that it keeps down, but sometimes it just leaks out. And then if that's not kept up to date, we soon get a little bit of leakage at the edges and the practice levels drop before you know it. One very sure way to find out whether there's poor professional practice going on is how much patients are given a choice to consent to what's happening to them or to decline it. I can refer you back to lectures on capacity. We won't worry about that tonight, but are patients allowed to choose, or are we just imposing stuff on them? And I think we need to be very, very cautious that when we're overworked and there's an awful lot of patients around and an awful lot of relatives, and bed managers are saying, move this patient, move that patient, and you just get into the, whoa, hang on a minute stage. That's when you can get into patients having to do stuff. And I've noticed particularly the rapid assessment areas and pit stop areas that people are having in departments, they're just doing to patients an awful lot. You know, they're kind of descending on them, doing to, and the patient's not really understanding what's going on and having the opportunity to go, get off me. That's not what I want. Many patients will just accept what they're given, but you know, we shouldn't assume that. We shouldn't assume that they're completely happy with everything we're doing, and they must be given the opportunity to say, no, pause, I don't want that NG tube. I'll have it later. It's very rarely a problem to defer things till a little bit later. Anybody come across any other issues around poor professional practice that you can think of, how we can prevent allegations that people have not been performing to guidance, performing to standards?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
I've been too thorough. Haven't left you enough room for manoeuvre. Okay, so my next one, joy of joys, is breaches of information governance. So, anyone have the joy of the text message or the email that says your information governance training isn't up to date? Anyone had that one yet? Oh, groan. So the requirement for information governance training is that it has to be done annually, and every organisation has to achieve 95% compliance. Otherwise, questions get asked from on high by the Information Commissioner. And funny old thing, everyone's a bit twitchy about the Information Commissioner because he has the power to fine you quite a lot of money. So organisations are very fussy about it. And it is an annual thing. And you think, goodness, is there nothing more important than this? And perhaps there is, and perhaps there isn't. It depends whether you're the one on the wrong end of a data breach. So this is all regulated under GDPR UK. What you'll find now is it says UK after it. So since Brexit, the European Union law doesn't apply. And so we have to say it's GDPR UK. I'm not quite sure what the difference is, but never mind. Clearly, I need to redo my information governance training to get that bit welded into my brain. But there are a few practical things you can check at work to make sure that you're not breaching information governance. Where are your confidential waste bins? Are they accessible, or can anyone just pull any confidential waste out of them?
It depends about the department.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Can you say that again? If you're talking, I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Right, my temporary space bar is not working. It depends where you are in the department. Most of them are down the nursing station, but we've just had a rejig in one particular area, and it's nowhere near the nursing station.
Yeah, it's a real problem. You know, you need them where there will always be a member of staff, because you can't have people nicking stuff out of them. Some places have confidential waste bins where you have to post into them. So they're locked tops and there's a slot and you post stuff in so nobody can get it out again, except the person who's got the key that comes and takes away the bag. When your confidential waste bins are emptied, where do those bin bags go? Do they sit in the corridor and wait to get collected, or sit in the sluice and wait to get collected? Or are they taken away straight away?
I would go down in the office area until they're all taken.
Yeah. So it's thinking of things like that as well. It sounds so daft, doesn't it? It's like, well, what do you mean, Jeanette? But actually, it's right, well, my confidential waste bin's full. I need to tie up the bin bag. Now, where do I put that full bin bag before it's collected? And who comes and collects that? Other things you need to think about is what your IT access processes are. Surefire way to make a member of staff completely useless to you is to deny them access to the IT systems. But equally, just because somebody didn't request the right IT access or it didn't happen quickly enough doesn't mean that you can just pass on passwords or pass on access. So many of you will have a generic floor access so that you can get in and do the basics. But further than that might well need your smart card. And if your smart card hasn't been enabled, forget it. You're not going to be able to get in and document anything on a patient's record. But rather more to the point, you're not going to be able to read the patient's record. So you can't harvest information you haven't been authorized to access. So no password sharing, not allowed. What about tailgating into your departments or propping doors open with a fire extinguisher on a hot day? Anyone done that?
We don't see much of that, actually.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. So the fire extinguishers keeping the doors open is a no. So you're on to that one. Good practice. Tailgating. Now, the trouble is we're all polite, aren't we? Now you see someone coming after you, you hold the door open for them. So that's done quite a lot. And that's a really tricky one to stop because it's considered bad manners to not hold a door open for people. So it's really difficult to think about that one and check that no one comes through. But you do need to think about it, particularly if you're using not very frequently used access points. One of our departments has a back door out to the back lift, if you see what I mean, which is handy for going up to the admissions floor, but isn't the way to the main inpatient wards. But that door's hardly ever used by anyone else. So hang on, who's this person? Why are they coming in if you don't recognise them? What about printers? Where do you put your printers?
Again, I
know. I'll tell you what, if I could have a printer that just did it when I asked it.
Oh my goodness, I'm glad it's not just.
It's not just you, no. We've taken to having IT come round. IT do a round and around somewhere between 9 and 10 in the morning. And they now come round and they check that everything's working. And they say to everybody, are you having any issues with the printers or the PCs? There's always something, but it makes a big difference having IT people come round every day and just check. But yeah, printers. What is it about the design of printers? But where have you got them? Where have you put them?
Nowhere near the nurse station.
Because where you actually physically locate printers is really important. Because if someone inadvertently prints to the wrong printer and it just pops up and you weren't expecting it, it's not acceptable for that to be accessible by the public. So printers need to be in what we used to call safe havens when we were using faxes. That means they have to be somewhere the public can't get at them. So somewhere they would have to go past staff to get at a printer. So you might have to a think about where you put your printers. You might not, you might be doing it great, but think about where the printer is. And that includes name band printers. You don't want name band printers being printed, name bands being printed off for the wrong person in the wrong floor. And it gets to a member of the public that shouldn't know someone's date of birth and all the rest of it. What about your computers? Go on, sorry.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question there? Are you saying, when you said about the faxes having to be where the public can't access them, a printer's supposed to be where the public can't access them now as well then?
So that doesn't mean they have to be in a back room with a locked door or anything that's inconvenient for you. It just, and they don't have to be somewhere that the public couldn't reach them, but they do have to be somewhere where the public would have to go past staff. So very often, if you think about it, really good place for printers, reception, because I'm not saying that's the only place for printers, but it's a good safe place for printers because the receptionists are facing the public, and no one, the only people coming in behind them into reception will be staff. That makes sense? But of course you do need some printers out on the floor as well. And it's just thinking through, not just where's there a bit of handy bench space, but where's there a bit of handy bench space that I can get it connected to the PC that hasn't got 6 meters of cable between them, or maybe just has a Wi-Fi connection, but the public can't get to that printer before I do. And you just have to stand and look at your department and say, hang on a minute, she's talked to me about printers. Now let's have a look and see where they are and whether they could be in a slightly less accessible place without inconveniencing everybody. But you should come across that in your information governance training, the importance of where you put a printer. What about computers locking? So that if you turn around and got to go somewhere, do you know how to lock a computer screen really quickly? What do you do at work when you leave a PC or a cow?
I must admit, we've just updated our system, and sometimes double tapping on it doesn't always work.
No. So there's the double tap, or some people have to have a card in to make it work at all. So a smart card has to go in. But of course you don't want to be leaving your smart card in. So some places have smart cards on kind of extendable curly whirly things, so that as you walk away from the computer, it pulls your card out and you go, oh yeah, that, and it goes back in your pocket, and that'll lock the screen. Or if all else fails, you should find, if you look at your keyboard, that you've got a button bottom left that has the Windows logo on it. If you press that and then L, it will lock your screen completely. So you just go Windows L and the screen will wipe and just put the screensaver picture up.
Yeah, that doesn't work on ours anymore.
Does it not?
Away, no.
Oh, how irritating of IT.
Yeah, since I've upgraded, so we can't Windows L anymore.
You can't Windows L anything. No. Well, other people might be able to Windows L, and you need to talk to your IT about how you can do the screen lock, because a Windows L is great for those for it works, because you ping straight when you go back and you put your username and password in again, you ping back to where you were, which is good. You don't need to lose your place, but oh, how very annoying of IT to do that to you. Okay, moving on then. Oh, I've put in a break. Do you want a break? You're very welcome to have one.
I'm all right in a minute.
Or would you like to push on? Push on? Whichever, don't mind. Speak now. Okay. Right, press on then. Right, so then the other one I thought of was breaches of confidentiality. So again, information governance training. And most people have to do an annual review of their code of conduct, which will remind you of your requirement to keep matters confidential. Now, I deliberately haven't put much detail on this slide because I thought it'd be useful to have a conversation about confidentiality, because it's one of those things that people think they know what they're talking about, and then when you get down into the detail, it can get a little bit confusing. So if I told you something was confidential, what would you think that I meant?
It means it doesn't go any further.
So this is, I'm having a conversation with you, Christina. This is confidential. So you can't, that means you can't talk to anyone about it. Is that what you're thinking?
You can't speak to anybody unless they're involved in that specific person's care.
Right. So that's one thing you can breach confidentiality for. If somebody else is dealing with that patient and has a contribution to make to their care, you of course can talk to that other professional, because otherwise how the heck do we all communicate between each other? That can get a little out of hand if we've got too many people involved in a person's care, but yeah, so that would be between us. What else? Where else could I potentially breach confidentiality? Oh, here's somebody else come to join us.
Losing the handover sheet.
Oh, handover sheets. That drives our Caldecott guardian mad, dropping handover sheets. So I know that happens in some areas. Not entirely convinced there's a good excuse for having handover sheets in an A&E department where everybody's up on a tracking screen. So you might want to think about that. Do we really, really need handover sheets? You might, but maybe if you're in charge of the department, you might want to hand over book. It's a lot harder to drop a book and not notice than it is to pull a sheet out of your pocket. So certainly if you're in charge of a shift, you might want to think about the kind of in charge shift report being in a book if you need to remember stuff and you don't want to put it on the PC. That's an option. What else cause confidentiality issues?
Apologies, I had to answer the door.
It's all right, don't worry. So other things that might cause an issue with confidentiality is if somebody's broken the law. So for example, the law requires you not to pick up the phone and tell the police, but if the police ask you, to tell them the name and address and date of birth of the person you believe was driving a car that has been in a road traffic collision. You're not obliged to tell the police the passengers' names, but you are obliged to tell the police the driver's name or the person you reasonably believe to be the driver. We also do have to pick up the phone and speak to the police about any knife wounds or any gunshot wounds. And it doesn't matter how the patient said they got the knife wound or the gunshot wound. They can tell us they did it to themselves. I don't care. Whatever you say, it doesn't make any difference. I'm still picking up the phone 101. I could be some time here while they answer, but we have to report in every gun and knife wound. You aware of that?
Yeah.
And I always tell more junior staff, get the nurse in charge to do that, not because they can't, but because actually as the nurse in charge, you should know about those situations. And it's really embarrassing if you don't. So getting the juniors to come and tell you and ask you to do the police conversation is better, because then you've got control over whether you do it yourself or whether you delegate it and who you delegate it to. What you don't want is a junior member of staff going off at a half cock because they've sort of half heard something, weren't entirely clear what they were doing, but think they're doing the right thing. And then you've got a dialogue opened with the police that you didn't need, or you would have preferred to have handled yourself. So wherever possible, well, I always tell junior staff, tell the nurse in charge and get the nurse in charge to make the calls to the police. What about other complaints? So we might have complaints about breach of confidentiality. You told my son what was going on and I didn't want you to tell him. I only wanted you to tell my daughter. How do we deal with that?
I normally, if somebody's asking me a question, I need to ask permission from the patient. So the biggest example is if somebody rings in and says, I'm ringing to find out how such and such is. You don't say, yeah, let me just find out. You say, hang on, let me find out if I've got somebody by that name.
Indeed.
And then going to that patient, so you're not even confirming that they're there without patient permission.
Yeah. So don't confirm or deny anything until you've spoken to the patient. It's a really tricky one to do, actually, just to get that right form of words. Let me just see if I have anyone by that name. Mrs. Vaughan, I've got somebody by the name of James on the phone. Don't tell him a thing. Righto. Terribly sorry, sir. I don't seem to have anyone by that name. I know we're lying, but that's not the point. The point is we don't need to breach confidentiality. What about if a member of staff has perhaps raised concerns about someone? It's always safeguarding concerns that become most contentious, so we'll use that as an example. What about if a member of staff raises safeguarding concerns and puts in a report to, let's say, children's social care about some foster carers, and the foster carers later come back and say, because of that allegation that you made, we've lost our livelihood. How do we deal with that? You breached confidentiality.
Sorry, can you just explain that again?
Okay. So you've got some concerns about a child and you decide you're going to make a safeguarding referral to children's social care. And the child is in the care of foster carers. So you do that and all, as far as you're concerned, job done. And then you later get a complaint back from the foster carers saying that you'd breached their confidentiality by making the referral and they are now not able to be foster carers anymore. And so you've caused them to lose their livelihood.
Duty of care for the child.
That's right. That's right. So on that one, there's a legislation in your favour which says, under the terms of the Children Act, under the terms of the Working Together document, actually the child's rights and needs top out. And if you have, it's always the case with law, if you reasonably believe that the child is being neglected or harmed by whoever, then you have to report it and then process has to go through. It can be a bumpy ride sometimes. It can be a bumpy ride. Okay, so now to some of the more horrible allegations. I always think these ones are the more difficult for everyone to do, and that's why I've put you a nice cute picture of a puppy on, because I figured a cute picture of a puppy is much nicer to look at than any other picture I could have got to accompany something that says allegations of sexual misconduct. So you should have in your organisation several policies that will work together on this one. And those policies will be regulated by law. So there is the Care Act of 2014, and there's the Children's Act of 2004, and then there's the NHS England Safeguarding Children and Young People and Adults in Risk in the NHS Safeguarding Accountability and Assurance Framework. And then there's Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018. Now they all work together, those government and documents and acts of parliament, to say that thou shalt not have any sexual contact with people who are under 18 or in your care in any shape or form. And then you must have in your organisation a policy to deal with allegations of misconduct against, and it's a specific phrase, it's called people in positions of trust. And that's all of us. So if you work and you've got an NHS lanyard and badge and all the rest of it, you're a person in a position of trust. And the more senior you are, the more seriously it is taken. So, you know, if the runner from medical records doesn't quite understand all of this, there's a slightly more forgiving attitude than myself as a senior nurse. I wouldn't be forgiven getting this wrong at all. Most of this is distilled into your consent policy as well. So you will have a policy somewhere in your organisation on consent, and that usually is taken to mean consent for medical procedures, but there are other levels of consent, as I'm sure you're all well aware. And you should somewhere along the line either have a chaperone policy or have something within your consent policy that talks about when you must and must not, when you must have a chaperone and when you perhaps need not. So why am I telling you this? Because as the nurse in charge, you may well have to deal with the first part of such allegations, and getting it right can be a bit tricky and it can be a little bit intimidating. So let's have a look at some allegations. These are real allegations, and let's see if we can work out what happened. You don't have to be judge and jury, you just have to work out what the heck might be going on here, and then we can have a look at how it'll be worked through in the background afterwards. So you've got a 90-year-old man that complains that the staff in your department have masturbated him. What do you think might have happened there?
I think it could have been where they've pulled back the foreskin to catheterise.
Yeah. So he could have been catheterised, or he could have had a convene put on, potentially. Or he might just have had a physical examination of his penis and testicles because he came in with some sort of urological problem. So what could you do here? So you've got a man complaining, and maybe your junior member of staff comes up to you and says, I don't know what to do. This patient has made this complaint. What could you do immediately?
To potentially have a little look in his notes for that session to see whether there's sort of any potential explanation for it.
Yeah. Have a look and see if there is what I would describe as a misunderstanding about clinical care. Okay. Have a look and then speak to the staff who undertook that. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that this was a catheterization. And then you can talk to the staff and see how they dealt with it. And it's just entirely possible that the staff didn't pay enough attention to explaining to the patient what was going on. Would you send those staff back in to see him?
No, does that not potentially come back to safeguarding staff?
It absolutely does. So you don't let those same staff go back in. Okay. Really important that. It doesn't mean that they've done anything wrong, but you pull those staff out and put other staff in with him. So you shift your allocations around. Doctors and nurses, unless you've got no choice. You know, if you're in a department where you've got one doctor, you haven't got a choice to swap out the doctor. But what you can do is make sure that the doctor is chaperoned should he or she need to go back into that patient. So, I mean, you're going to have to put in a datex, but with that, you can explain that actually within the record, there is evidence that this is likely to have been a misinterpretation of a catheterization. And that would come through to safeguarding staff and HR. I know that sounds a bit odd, but HR get involved with anything that's a complaint against staff. So safeguarding are likely to do exactly the same again. Go through, look at the record, go, oh yeah, I can see what's happened. Then look at how you've dealt with it, look at your record, and then it will depend then how we've dealt with it. But you could, as the nurse in charge, explain to the man, go in and see him with a witness and say, just take him through step by step about the catheterization. And that might be all it takes to settle his mind as well, because we don't need him thinking that he's been sexually assaulted. It's not very nice, but neither's having a catheter put in. What about this? So we've got a 26-year-old lady who presented with back pain, and she complains that a doctor sexually assaulted her during physical examination. A chaperone was present throughout.
Could it be the PR examination for query code requirement?
That's right. So this was these are, as I say, these are all real cases. So yes, this is a lady who the GP thought was cauda equina, so she obviously had to have a PR. She'd never had a PR before. Nothing wrong with that. There was a chaperone. The doctor was really particular about having a chaperone with him, and the chaperone was an experienced chaperone. But the lady was quite convinced that he'd actually put his fingers into her vagina and had sexually assaulted her by digital penetration. Why do you think she thought that? Can't hear anybody talking.
Sorry, I'm thinking.
Oh, that's all right. So what it is that the wall between the rectum and the vagina is very thin. And so that poking around in the rectum, and you know how they kind of go all round, it felt to her very similar to having to the feelings of something being inside her vagina. And so she thought that he had sexually assaulted her in front of the chaperone. Now, again, what would you do as the nurse in charge if you're confronted with that allegation? How would you manage that one?
Again, surely would it not be in the staff's best interest to take a step back and potentially be treated by someone else?
Yep. Yep, absolutely. So swap the staff out if you possibly can. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing a PR
But she's
for a
saying
cauda equina. It's got to be done.
But she's saying a chaperone was there, so she's making an accusation even with a chaperone. So that would sort of indicate that even with a chaperone, this woman doesn't feel safe with those particular people.
But what's happened here is there hasn't been an adequate explanation of why she needed a PR, what that entailed, and what it would feel like before it's been done. So this particular case escalated quite severely, and we were unable to manage it quickly at the time. But you live and you learn. What would have really helped is an explanation to her there and then of why she needed the PR. Really, to prevent it would have been good to explain why a PR was needed and gain consent for that before moving on to the physical. The doctor thought that he'd done that well enough. He clearly hadn't. But hey, you know, we all live and learn. It was a very unpleasant experience for everybody working that allegation through. We got there in the end without with everybody's dignity and job intact, but it took a little bit of careful and slow manoeuvring. Right. An 84-year-old lady complains to you that they've been shoving things up there, they have. What's that about? And she don't want anyone near her again.
I suppose you'd initially need to find out who she was talking about and where she was when this happened before you explore any further.
So that each time it's find out the facts, find out which staff were involved, swap out the staff if you can, and do the adverse incident report. Now, this could be anything. It's probably a PR or suppositories or an enema or possibly a catheterization or possibly a PV exam, depending on exactly what was wrong with her. 84-year-old chap presented with abdominal pain and complained he'd been sexually assaulted. Bit unusual. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think again, potentially there's a couple of things this could be. It could be a testicular exam for sort of things like torsion and things like that, but it also could be a PR exam with regard to query constipation and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So 84 is a bit old for it to be a torsion. Not a typical age group for a torsion.
Not necessarily torsion, but a urological issue.
It could be, and you know, he's certainly in the right age bracket for waterworks problems, as they all seem to phrase it. So needing a PR to feel the prostate. Upon fact finding with this, what happened was he had an enema for constipation. Now, why anyone thought it was a good idea to give him an enema in an A&E department is beyond me. But anyway, he had an enema. This complaint came in after he'd left, after he'd been discharged some days later. But he was complaining about the situation, and his carers back at the place he lived noticed a very real change in his behaviour. And he thought he'd been sexually assaulted, but you're quite right. It was an enema for constipation. So again, go and find out what was done, find out who was there, talk to them, find out what happened, and make sure that's in your incident report. What we got here, a 32-year-old lady complains that a doctor exposed her breasts when he was examining her abdomen. There was no chaperone present. Thoughts?
Obvious lack of chaperone.
Yeah, there's some. I've discovered, following up complaints like this, that doctors can be a little bit lax about chaperones when really they ought not to be. They don't seem to. I know it's a bit of pain trying to get hold of a chaperone when they want to do something, but that third party is massively important.
I suppose he wouldn't have thought that he needed a chaperone if he was examining her abdomen. I could understand that. But do you think maybe he was just a little bit lax with her clothing?
No. It actually, on investigation, it's absolutely true. That's exactly what happened. But on talking to the doctor was being very, very by the textbook. And the textbook for how do you examine an abdomen says that you have to expose the patient from nipple line to pubic line. Otherwise, you're not doing a proper textbook abdominal examination. And because that doctor was a bit, I will do it by the textbook, and hadn't quite learnt yet that a little bit of social skill was required managing these, and certainly a little bit more empathy with the patient. He just exposed her exactly as the textbook said, without doing the job properly, and making sure a chaperone was present, who could have just preserved the lady's modesty. So a bit of work with the doctor there on, really a bit more thought. And shall we just keep an eye? So that doctor ended up having to be supervised a bit more closely by a consultant for quite a while. Okay, so what you're getting there largely is anything clinical that involves anything normally covered by pants is a bit of a problem, and so having realized that is an issue, really my best advice to keep staff safe and not on the receiving end of allegations is to make sure that if anyone's going to do any procedure that involves the general area covered by pants, be that genitals, be that buttocks, be that anuses, whatever it be, anything covered by pants, you really need to have 2 staff in there so that you always have a chaperone. And actually what you need to do as a preventative measure to prevent this ever happening is that one person does the task, whatever it is that you're there for, and the chaperone talks to the patient and explains each step of it as you're going along. So, right, well, you've got that terrible pain in your tummy. We need to get rid of it, and what it is it's a whole big pile of poo sitting in there, and we need to get some of it out. So we're going to give you some suppositories to try and get some poo out, and it's going to feel horrible because Jenny there is going to put those suppositories up your bum, and it will feel really, really horrible for a minute, but it's to try and get the poo out, so that you can talk that through, because otherwise patients don't know what we're doing, and it just feels like we're assaulting them. So what other things have we come across that don't fall into the under the pants category? We've had a few interesting ones. We've had more than one where a member of staff has asked for a patient's phone number and then arranged to meet up for sex outside work. That's a no, folks. Just for the avoidance of doubt, that's a no. We don't go to work to pick up a date. Someone who phoned a patient, so that's a data breach and a confidentiality breach because they've taken the patient's phone number to check they're okay without permission, and then they've arranged to meet up for walks. Okay, that's a no. We don't do that either. This one isn't a sexual misconduct, but stealing drugs from a drugs cupboard. The word steal there should give you a clue that that's a no. If you ever take drugs from a drugs cupboard for your own use that aren't just could you possibly give me a couple of paracetamol, got a stinking headache, and get somebody else to give them to you, then actually we're in trouble. We've had all sorts of drugs go missing. Over the course of my career, I've had the delights of diamorphine go missing, morphine go missing, diazepam go missing, propofol go missing. It's not pleasant. So I can only say if you start seeing drugs disappearing, get senior advice. And I can't overemphasize the importance of the CD checks at the beginning and end of shifts. We've had patients asked for a date by various staff. That's a no. We've had a member of staff hit a patient. To be strictly fair, the patient did hit them first, but hitting a patient back, that's a no. Swearing at a patient, that's a no. It doesn't matter how much you're provoked, you don't retaliate with the similar or worse language. And we have had a member of staff, unfortunately, rather surprisingly, arrested for making, storing, or and having available to view child sexual abuse images. We're not to call them child pornography anymore. We are to call them child sexual abuse images because that's what they are. So that wasn't too great either. That one was a nice straightforward, right, well, seeing as you've come to arrest them, we leave it to you. But then there's all sorts of things that have to follow as a result. So with those sort of things, you might well end up, you're certainly going to end up having to get hold of HR very quickly. You might well end up being told that the member of staff will have to be suspended, or may not be coming back. So you may suddenly have to sort out reallocating your staff for that. So what happens behind the scenes after you've had this first awfulness dumped upon you? Well, first off, there should be an allegations management policy of some type sitting in your policy library that HR and safeguarding and your line manager, but it would predominantly be HR and safeguarding working together, will follow, and they will work their way through flow charts and at speed sometimes, depending on what exactly the situation is. There tends to be an absolute tight confidentiality around these issues, so you may never hear the outcome. So if it just happened on your shift and you got wind of something but weren't entirely sure what happened, and then somebody doesn't appear at work again and you think, well, what happened there? You may never ever hear. If you were the person directly involved, then you know what happened, you know what the allegation was, but you may equally never hear what happened to the member of staff. Sometimes you might, it just depends. The senior line manager will usually be pulled in with human resources and safeguarding. So they may well they'll either triage the allegations, so they'll pull together a very short notice meeting where a senior HR member of staff, a senior safeguarding member of staff, and the senior line manager for the area, plus or minus someone like the deputy medical director or the deputy chief nurse for those respective professions, will just look at the allegation and work out what has to be done next in line with policy, and they'll hand out jobs between them, and they'll all be tasked with some component of it and will have to go off and do it. There will be some form of risk assessment which will come out of HR. HR have these that are sort of sat there in the not very often used folders. So they wouldn't expect a line manager to know they are there, and they certainly wouldn't expect you as a nurse in charge of an area and on shift to know that they were there. But they will have some sort of risk assessment, which they will want to sit down and do with the member of staff concerned and work out where the risk is coming from, and whether that member of staff is a risk ongoing to patients or not. And there'll be a conclusion to that which will guide further actions. You will have some sort of staff support mechanism that will be attached to HR. That might be a staff support hub, it might be counselling, it might be health psychology, something like that. But HR will put staff support in place for your member of staff. They won't expect that to be you. They will put that in place. If a crime is suspected, police will be informed. Usually safeguarding will have the conversation with the police, and the police decide whether a crime has been committed and whether or not prosecution of that crime is in the public interest. Sometimes they will go, yeah, acknowledge that shouldn't have happened. It is a crime, that is an assault, that is theft, but actually the scale of it, it's not appropriate that we prosecute because it's not in the public interest, and you are already taking disciplinary action, so that's fine. Other times, the scale of the issue will be such that the police will go, no, we are pursuing this and we're opening an inquiry. And then they will pick their way through their inquiry processes. And in my experience, once we started a police inquiry, it can go on a very, very long time before you come to a conclusion. And meanwhile, you've got a member of staff who may not be at work, or may be at work with restrictions in practice or something like that. And then there's someone called the LADO. That stands for the Local Area Designated Officer. And this is a very, very powerful person who has to receive a referral if a member of staff has an allegation made against them along any of the lines I've given you this evening, where that member of staff has their own children or has access to children at work. So that could be all of your emergency department staff who might fall into that category, just because you work in a mixed emergency department, and therefore they could come across children in the course of their work. So an allegations management meeting will then be held by the LADO, who will call Children's Social Services, the police and the employer, and they are extremely powerful, and they can request a lot of additional actions. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they say, no, that's fine. There's everything that we could ask for has already been done. But they can require an awful lot of additional investigation and ultimately action. So what could be the outcome? So the first outcome is there's nothing proved and there's no action against a member of staff. So, for example, one of the situations where actually patient said that it'd been something had been shoved up there and you can't work it out. We had one where the lady was most insistent that she'd been sexually assaulted by a male member of staff. But actually, when we went through it really, really carefully with her and then really, really carefully through the notes, it transpired that actually the assault had been 10 years ago and we couldn't work out who it was, but it was an admission 10 years prior. So there was nothing proved. There was no action against any member of staff on that admission because actually we worked out after a lot of investigation that it wasn't about that admission. So that was helpful. Very often it's that the patient's misunderstood clinical care, and so actually you go through and you explain it to the patient, you explain it to the relatives if you need to, but there's no action against a member of staff. It's just not a problem. Alternatively, the allegation may be proved. A member of staff had used a patient's phone number, phoned them, arranged to go out for walks. So really that was dependent on the disciplinary policy there. So where were we on the scale of verbal warning, written warning, final written warning, dismissal? That's for HR to decide. So once we've proven that there was no harm to the patient and safeguarding could withdraw, then it's a disciplinary matter and HR make a disciplinary judgment based on employment law and obviously the local policy, which is a distillation of employment law. Allegation proved, and we've got criminal proceedings in addition to any disciplinary actions. So very clearly the police coming in to arrest someone because they've been involved in child sexual abuse image, that went to criminal proceedings as well as disciplinary stuff. So that was fairly straightforward in that regard, although rather took everyone by surprise. Then again, an allegation might be proved, but then you kind of have to wait, and the criminal proceedings have to go through, the police investigation has to go through. Eventually they get convicted of a crime, and then there's a sentence. Now, once there's a sentence and a conviction, then DBS can be informed. So There's quite strict rules about when you tell DBS, so that when a DBS check's done on them in future, it comes up on the DBS check. And then you may also find that you have to go to the regulatory body. So in our case, it'd be the NMC, but it may equally be the GMC or the Healthcare Professionals Council. So wherever it's a registered member of staff, that regulatory body also comes into play. And then what we're doing is we're managing employment status, we're managing safeguarding of that patient and any other patient that member of staff could come into contact with. We're managing we're not managing it, but we're kind of coordinating with police on criminal proceedings, and we're coordinating with regulatory body who manage the registration and will make their own decisions about that. So those are the outcomes, which is why I say it's so important that we prevent this if we possibly can, by making really clear to people what the standards of behaviour are that we expect from them, and that we keep their professional standards as high as possible. Oh, now I didn't do any question slides, so that surprised me slightly. That's your QR code for the evaluation. While you're zapping it, I've tested it. It will take you through to the MFEN evaluation form, and you want lesson 29. It's right down at the bottom. While you're letting your device do that and getting through to the form to fill in a few minutes when we've all finished, are there any questions on what I've presented? Because I realise it's we've worked our way through stuff we can prevent and make better, to the stuff that it really gets quite deep and difficult.
I think one of the things that it does do is highlight the importance of communication.
Mm. It's amazing how people can get the wrong end of the stick. And it's amazing, not just that how patients can misinterpret stuff, but also how staff cannot understand the standards of behaviour expected of them. And, you know, you think it's obvious, and it isn't. It isn't obvious at all. Okay, so if you've all zapped the QR code, I shall just move on to tell you that we've put in an extra session for next week. We weren't going to do a fifth Thursday of the month, but we've decided we will, because we've been asked to do the same session 3 times for different groups of learners on our programs. So Judith Morgan's going to come and do a session on getting started with your FEN portfolio for you next week. Same time, same place, same codes. So if you want to do that session, that will be available then, and obviously will be recorded so that you'll be able to watch it later if you can't make next Thursday evening. But that's to help you if you're deciding that you want to assemble a portfolio of evidence of your ability to lead in emergency care. Then that will be a useful session for you. And if there's any questions about the qualification that we offer in we're about to offer a level 7 qualification in leading emergency care. So that will be a good opportunity to speak to Judith then and talk portfolios. Otherwise, thank you all for your company tonight. It's really nice of you to join me for the lecture. And I'll either see you next week or on another Thursday evening for another topic. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.